August 3, 1962, Los Angeles, 2 days before the end. Marilyn Monroe was officially still one of the most famous women in the world. Her name alone could fill theaters. Her image was everywhere. But in reality, she was being quietly erased. Studios had stopped calling. Friends had stopped visiting. Decisions about her life were being made without her presence. And in those final 48 hours, something unmistakable happened. Marilyn Monroe was left alone inside a system that had already moved on without her. The public never saw this version of Marilyn. The headlines would come later, the speculation would follow. But in early August 1962 there was no drama yet, only silence. A silence that grew heavier with every hour, because what happened to Marilyn Monroe did not begin with her death. It began with her disappearance from everyone else's priorities. Just weeks earlier, 20th Century Fox had fired her. The official explanation was unreliability. Missed shooting days, health issues, insurance risks. Unofficially, it was punishment. Marilyn had challenged the studio system for years. She demanded better scripts, equal pay, creative control. She refused to be managed like a decorative asset. By 1962, Hollywood had grown tired of the fight. When Fox terminated her contract, the message was clear. She was no longer protected. This mattered more than the public realized. In classic Hollywood, being fired was not just a career setback, it was a signal. Studios spoke to each other. Agents followed cues. Support disappeared quickly. Marilyn was suddenly labeled difficult again, a word that followed her everywhere but meant something very specific. She was no longer compliant. On August 3, Marilyn was at her home in Brentwood, a modern minimalist house meant to offer privacy. It did not feel private anymore. People came and went, doctors, assistants, calls were monitored. Schedules were suggested, not asked. Marilyn's life was being supervised but not supported. She was watched but not listened to. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Marilyn was not abandoned in the traditional sense. She was surrounded by people, but none of them were there for her. Each relationship had a function: a doctor managing symptoms, a studio protecting liability, a publicist managing optics, no one managing her well-being as a human being. During these days, Marilyn's emotional state was unstable but not chaotic. She was not in constant hysteria. She was exhausted, deeply tired, tired of negotiating her existence, tired of being evaluated, tired of being misunderstood. The version of Marilyn who needed help did not match the version the system knew how to handle. On August 4, the pressure intensified. The phone rang often. Some calls were professional, some were social, some were vague and indirect. What is documented is not what was said but how she sounded. Witnesses later described her voice as slow, disconnected, not panicked, not dramatic, just distant. That distance mattered. Because when people truly fear for someone, they act, they go there, they intervene, they stay. None of that happened. Instead, responsibility was diffused. Everyone assumed someone else was in charge. The doctor had seen her. The housekeeper was present. The studio situation was temporary. No emergency was declared. No line was crossed. This is the danger of controlled isolation. When a person is never fully alone, but never fully accompanied. When concern exists in theory, but not in action. Marilyn Monroe existed in that gap during her final 48 hours. She had spoken about wanting stability, about wanting rest, about wanting to feel safe. These were not new desires, but now there was no structure left to contain them. Her career was uncertain. Her personal relationships were strained. Her trust in institutions had collapsed, and yet she was still expected to perform normalcy. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened that day. No public breakdown, no emergency hospitalization, no final statement. That is precisely why these hours matter, because tragedies rarely announce themselves. They unfold quietly through inaction. By the evening of August 4, Marilyn was physically present in her home but psychologically disconnected from the world around her. The lights were on, the door was closed, the phone was near, but no one crossed the threshold in time. The final hours of Marilyn Monroe are often framed as mysterious, but the most unsettling part is not what is unknown, it is what is known. She was vulnerable, she was isolated, and the systems designed to protect her were inactive. What happened next would later be debated for decades, but before any theory, before any autopsy, before any headline, there was a simpler truth. Marilyn Monroe spent her last 48 hours being managed, not cared for, observed, not held, surrounded yet profoundly alone. And that is where the story of her final days truly begins. August 4, 1962, morning. The day began without urgency. There were no sirens, no warnings, no visible crisis. Marilyn Monroe woke up in her Brentwood home as she had many times before, inside a routine shaped almost entirely by others. Her schedule was no longer her own. Doctors decided when she should rest. Assistants decided when she should speak. Studios decided when she was valuable. In these final days, Marilyn existed inside a structure that functioned efficiently, but without warmth. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, remained a central presence in her life. His involvement went far beyond weekly therapy. He monitored her daily state, advised on her medication, and influenced who had access to her. The intention, at least on paper, was protection, but protection can quietly become control. Marilyn's autonomy had been reduced in the name of stability. By this point, medication had become a constant: barbiturates to sleep, stimulants to wake, sedatives to calm anxiety. This was not unusual in Hollywood, but Marilyn's dependence was deeper because her emotional regulation had been outsourced. Decisions about dosage were often made for her. Pills replaced presence. Chemistry replaced care. That morning, Marilyn did not leave the house. She did not attend meetings. She did not socialize. This absence was not dramatic, but it was noticeable. She had once been impossible to ignore. Now her silence barely registered. The industry had learned to function without her participation. What makes this period critical is not a single event, but a pattern. Marilyn's support system was fragmented. Each person involved believed they were only responsible for a part. The doctor handled mental health. The studio handled contracts. The housekeeper handled logistics. No one handled the whole person. Throughout the day, Marilyn received calls. Some were related to her career. Negotiations with Fox were still technically open. There was talk of rehiring her under stricter conditions. Lower pay, reduced control, a symbolic return that would reaffirm the studio's authority. Marilyn was aware of this. The offer was not stability, it was submission. This placed her in an impossible position: accept the terms and erase years of resistance, refuse and remain professionally isolated. For someone whose identity was deeply tied to being valued, this was not just a business decision, it was existential. Her emotional state during these hours has often been exaggerated or distorted. She was not visibly hysterical. She was not making public threats. She was quiet, withdrawn. That quietness was later misread as calm. In reality, it was resignation. Observers would later describe her voice as slow, her energy low, her focus scattered. These are not signs of drama, they are signs of depletion. Marilyn Monroe was not spiraling outward, she was collapsing inward. The house itself reflected this condition. It was modern, clean, and sparse. Designed to offer privacy, it instead amplified isolation. Large windows, empty rooms, silence between movements. There was nothing in the environment that suggested grounding or comfort. Everything was functional, nothing was nurturing. As the day moved toward evening, responsibility continued to circulate without settling. People checked in, but no one stayed. Everyone assumed the situation was under control. After all, Marilyn was not alone. Someone was always nearby. This assumption would later become central to the tragedy. Controlled environments often mask danger. When supervision replaces connection, warning signs are easily missed. Marilyn was not asking for help in obvious ways. She had learned that visible need often led to punishment or ridicule, so she withdrew. In the late afternoon, Dr. Greenson visited again. He later stated that she appeared stable. That assessment has been debated ever since. Stability in this context meant the absence of disruption. It did not mean emotional safety. A person can appear calm while being profoundly unwell. Marilyn's history made this especially dangerous. Her life had been shaped by abandonment. Each major relationship ended in withdrawal. Each institution that promised care eventually prioritized itself. By August 1962, this pattern was deeply internalized. She no longer expected rescue. Evening approached, the light changed, the house grew quieter, calls became less frequent. The sense of being forgotten, which had followed her since childhood, returned with full force. Fame had delayed it, not erased it. This is the moment that matters most in understanding what followed. Marilyn Monroe was not overwhelmed by a single catastrophe. She was worn down by cumulative neglect, by systems that functioned smoothly while failing her completely. The final hours of August 4th were not chaotic, they were empty, and emptiness when prolonged can be as dangerous as despair. As night settled over Brentwood, Marilyn remained inside her home, surrounded by structure but devoid of connection. The mechanisms designed to manage her life were still operating. What was missing was anyone willing to simply be there. By the time darkness fully arrived, the conditions for tragedy were already in place. Not because of what happened that night, but because of everything that had not happened before it. August 4, 1962, night. As darkness settled over Brentwood, Marilyn Monroe entered the most fragile phase of her final 48 hours. The outside world slowed down, but inside the house time felt suspended. There were no cameras, no audience, no performance required. This was the moment when the carefully maintained image dissolved and only the woman remained. The evening did not begin with despair. It began with waiting. Marilyn waited for calls, for reassurance, for some indication that she still mattered beyond contracts and headlines. The phone rang, but never in the way she hoped. Conversations were brief, polite, non-committal. People spoke as if tomorrow was guaranteed. One of the most documented calls that night came from Peter Lawford. The tone of the conversation would later become famous, but at the time it raised no immediate alarm. Marilyn's voice was described as soft, slowed, distant. She did not sound hysterical. She did not threaten anything. She sounded tired, and fatigue rarely triggers emergency responses. This was the central failure of that night. Marilyn did not present as a crisis. She presented as manageable. And because she had spent years being managed, the people around her mistook emotional withdrawal for stability. Inside the house, the atmosphere was controlled but empty. The lights remained on, doors were closed, medication was accessible. Marilyn's relationship with pills had never been secret. Doctors were aware. Assistants were aware. It had become normalized. That normalization erased urgency. She moved through the evening slowly. There was no sign of planning, no farewell ritual, no dramatic gesture. This absence would later be used to support multiple interpretations, but in that moment, it simply reflected someone who had stopped expecting intervention. Marilyn's life had taught her a brutal lesson. Visible need often resulted in punishment. Missed calls turned into professional consequences. Emotional honesty became tabloid fodder. Vulnerability was never rewarded, so she learned to retreat quietly. As the hours passed, responsibility continued to dissolve. Everyone who had contact with her assumed someone else was closer. Someone else would check. Someone else would act if needed. This diffusion of care created the most dangerous condition of all: collective indifference disguised as structure. The housekeeper noticed the bedroom light was still on later than usual. This detail would later become significant. At the time, it was not alarming. Marilyn often stayed up late. Irregular hours were part of her known behavior. Familiarity dulled concern. There is no evidence of a final decision made in a single moment. What exists instead is a gradual narrowing. Options felt fewer, paths felt closed, the future felt conditional. Marilyn Monroe did not face a dramatic crossroads that night. She faced quiet inevitability. Her career, once the center of her identity, had become a source of instability. The studio's conditional offer loomed in the background. Return but smaller, stay famous but controlled. Survival required surrender. For someone who had spent years fighting to be taken seriously, this felt like erasure. Emotionally, Marilyn was isolated in a way fame could not prevent. Childhood abandonment had taught her that love was temporary and conditional. That lesson resurfaced whenever support systems weakened. By August 1962, it had resurfaced completely. The night deepened, external communication slowed. The world outside continued without her participation. Inside the bedroom, the conditions for irreversible harm quietly solidified, not through chaos, but through neglect. At some point, the door was closed and locked. This action has been endlessly debated. What matters is not the lock itself, but what it symbolized. Marilyn withdrew fully into a space where no one was actively entering. The phone remained nearby. Medication remained accessible. The environment was static. No one crossed the threshold to interrupt the trajectory that had been forming for years. This is the moment where myth often replaces reality. Later narratives would seek villains, conspiracies, hidden hands, but before any of that there was a simpler failure. Marilyn Monroe was not alone because no one knew. She was alone because no one acted. By the time the house grew completely quiet, the outcome was no longer a sudden possibility. It was a continuation, a system doing what it had always done, maintaining order while allowing a person to disappear inside it. The night of August 4th did not end with noise or drama, it ended with silence, a silence that no one chose to break in time. August 5, 1962, early morning. The silence inside the Brentwood house did not immediately feel alarming, it felt routine. Marilyn Monroe often slept late, irregular hours were normal. What changed was not the absence of sound but the absence of response. The bedroom light was still on, the door was still closed, the phone calls went unanswered, time passed without correction. When concern finally surfaced, it did not arrive as panic, it arrived as inconvenience. Something was off, something required checking. The housekeeper approached the bedroom and saw Marilyn through the window. She was lying still. The position did not immediately signal death, it signaled distance, a body present, a person unreachable. Authorities were contacted, procedures activated, roles resumed. In death, Marilyn was immediately surrounded again. Doctors, police, reports, statements. What had been missing in life returned instantly once she was no longer alive to need it. The official conclusion came quickly: probable suicide, acute barbiturate poisoning, no extensive delay, no prolonged uncertainty. The system closed the file efficiently. That efficiency would later fuel suspicion, but efficiency was exactly how Marilyn had always been handled. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines framed the story as inevitable: a tragic blonde, a fragile star, a woman undone by her own excess. The narrative was familiar because it was convenient, it required no accountability. If Marilyn was doomed by nature, then no one failed her. What disappeared in that narrative was context. The firing, the isolation, the overkutpun, the lack of coordinated care, the diffusion of responsibility. These details were not dramatic enough for headlines, they required reflection. Reflection was slower than scandal. Friends expressed shock. Studios expressed sadness. The same institutions that had withdrawn from her life now positioned themselves as mourners. The public watched a collective performance of grief that felt sincere, yet arrived too late to matter. The question that followed was not only how Marilyn died, but why no one intervened when the warning signs were visible. She had been unstable before and survived. She had been vulnerable before and recovered. What made August 1962 different was not the depth of her pain, but the absence of response to it. Conspiracy theories would emerge in the years that followed. Political connections, hidden relationships, altered evidence. Some questions remain unresolved, but even without speculation, one truth stands firm: Marilyn Monroe was left in a condition where harm could occur without interruption. This does not require a villain, it requires a system that prioritizes control over care, image over intimacy, function over humanity. Marilyn Monroe was not destroyed by fame alone, she was diminished by structures that treated her as an asset long after she needed to be treated as a person. Her death shocked the world, but her life had been warning it for years. The signs were not hidden, they were normalized. Dependency was reframed as treatment, isolation was reframed as privacy, exhaustion was reframed as temperament. Each reframing pushed intervention further away. In the days that followed, Marilyn's image became immortal. Photographs circulated, films replayed, the myth expanded, but the woman behind it was flattened into symbolism, either a victim of herself or a mystery to be solved, rarely a human shaped by repeated neglect. The most unsettling part of Marilyn Monroe's final story is not what remains unknown, it is what was visible and still ignored. She did not vanish suddenly, she faded gradually in plain sight. August 5, 1962, did not mark the moment Marilyn Monroe disappeared. It marked the moment the world noticed she was already gone.